The idea is to keep it really brief, to the point, and each one making a sharp, provocative point, because those of you who are dozing awake probably can be woken up with very short and sharp views of our panelists. It's really the context. I mean, I'll just mention a couple of words, which is really, we are in the middle of a great transformation. I mean, in the world, you can see anywhere around, there's extraordinary change that is unfolding. And India that is changing equally fast. And the nature of India's society and the nature of India's interaction with the world too is changing quite dramatically. Just to use one metric, it took us 75 years to get our economy to $3 trillion. We will, even with the most conservative estimates, we will add another 3 trillion, if not 4 trillion, in the next decade. So from 3 trillion, 3.5 trillion today, by 2030, it will be a $7 trillion economy, even by the worst headwinds that we face. So that will be a very, very different India, dealing with a very, very different world. So the nature of our engagement with that world, as well as the nature of our internal organization, all have to be fundamentally reevaluated. And many of the assumptions, the kind of cliches, principles that have guided us in the 20th century or in the last 20 years, so many of them will become quite, I won't say irrelevant, need to be reconsidered. I mean, take fresh look at various concepts, and that we need to prepare for a much larger role in the world, as well as prepare to manage the extraordinary exponential tumult that's going to come within the country. Because when you move from 3 trillion to 7 trillion, I'm not even talking about ORF saying at India at 100, I'm only talking about the next 10 years. So the change is going to be enormous, and for that, how we manage that change is going to be the biggest challenge. And I think we have a very interesting panel. All of them are going to speak about one particular theme of this extraordinary transformation taking place. So I think in a world that is changing, I would say think tanks have a big role and to contribute to a new way in which India deals with the world. And it's an exciting time to be a think tanker. So let me congratulate all of you with also many young people around the table here. So we look forward to this extraordinary discussion here. And I'm going to start with Anna Roy, who's a senior advisor in the Niti Aayog. My question to you is really one of the big changes that's unfolding in the world, and which Niti Aayog has been engaged with, is really the technological revolution that is changing the nature of the global economy, changing the nature of the Indian economy. Good old Marx, I think, said, if we change the nature of the forces of production, the relations of production too will change. That is, the technological change will drive huge changes in domestic organization as well as the power structure in the international system. And Niti Aayog has been at the forefront of thinking about this digital transformation. So if you look at this, take your next 2 to 3 minutes to say, is India ready to cope with that revolution? If we are not, how are we going to prepare both the internal rearrangement as well as the profoundly changing global rules to negotiate new rules for the digital economy? Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'll be very brief. 2 points. Not only is India ready, but for the first time, I think India is geared to set the rules for the global world in the space of technology. I refer to the IR 4.0, basically a cyber-physical phase of technology where the digital has really come into the physical phase. And this is where India really has its mettle. First of all, it allows, this technology allows us to overcome our age-old challenges, whether it is, access barrier, availability of resources, experts in fields like education, health, etc. So first, a lot of opportunities. Second, a lot of challenges within the country, and the concept that Niti Aayog gave in the strategy paper, India being the garage of the world. So you solve for India, you solve for 44% of the world. Third point, I'm told that Sharad was here, iSpirit is leading this, about, this technology, unlike the previous industrial revolutions that we have seen, here it is all about setting the rules, the governance frameworks, the protocols, and we already demonstrated how we do it in UPI. We have replicated India's stack in health through ABDM, in logistics through ULIP, and as we speak, we are looking at labor and other such sectors. So a stack approach where it is allow 1,000 flowers to bloom, putting government at its rightful place, not to crowd out the private sector, but to provide the enabling framework through the platformization. And I think these are some of the constituents which will allow us to set the guidelines. And for that, I think we must not lose the narrative. And Shaurya, the iSpirit, along with Niti, like DEPA was released by Niti in collaboration with iSpirit. So these are the revolutionary changes which will allow us to set the goalposts for the world, to determine how this technology expands and how we embrace it. And finally, what is always told by the government and by Prime Minister himself, the human in the loop approach that we are now continuously following, outcome-oriented approach. So I think we are not only ready, as I said in the beginning, but we can guide the very process of technology adoption in solving problems as we go along. Thank you very much.
Very briefly, just a follow-up to you. International rules on digital trade, digital governance, are we lagging behind? Are we ready to negotiate a new set of global rules?
I think it's work in progress.
Okay.
And data is the key. And we are making some progress. It's a very, difficult area. We are now getting the G20 presidency. I think time is ripe for us to, take on the challenge, and we can kind of take it forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that opening intervention, and very brief and pointed. So let me call Shaurya Doval. Shaurya, last 30 years, since 1991, everyone was for Washington consensus. Globalization, whether it's China, Russia, India, everyone agreed on a particular path towards progress. Now, in the last few years, we've seen a profound change in that approach. So the political interests of different competing groups within societies and between states are challenging the premise that globalization helps everyone equally. So how do you, and India itself, we've changed our attitude to globalization. So how do you see this contestation, and where do you see it going in the next few years?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I will try to sort of sum up your question, or the point that you position that you made was whether political ideologies and economics should be kept separate. As you said, in 30 years, what I was told was that, last 30 years, political ideologies have come along with a package of economic ideologies. But today, are we in a world where they are different, or, where they are necessarily in conflict? Now, I think the assumption there is that you are saying that it is political ideologies and economic governance or economic growth should not be clubbed together. That is, make economics politically neutral. I agree to that proposition, because I think that to the maximum extent that it is possible, there are certain aspects of economic growth or economic prosperity that can be made complementary to political ideology and not necessarily in conflict with it. Now, even in India, we are actually seeing that there are aspects, there will certainly be aspects of economics that will always be ideological. But there are aspects like economic growth It's a measurable mathematical number that has nothing to do with political ideology. Employment, again, you can measure it, higher the better. There is no need for political ideologies. Increased exports, decreased imports, and many examples. Even the very fact that universality, sabka saath, sabka vikas, that benefits to all the citizens, not politically, ideologically different. It's economically neutral, it's economically good. So, the very fact that there are certain aspects of economics that will always remain neutral. There are certain aspects where it is distribution of economic benefits. That region, caste, gender, class, they will always remain political. And in a democracy, there will always be a debate about whether that should be given to this versus that. You mentioned that India grew to 3 trillion in the last 30 years.
So last 75 years.
Last 75 years, actually. If you take India's progress in the last, let's say between 50 to 75 years, that is about 91, the performance of India's economic growth politics has interfered with it. India's economic growth has been above average, but has not been stupendous. It could have been much better had political ideologies not interfered with the neutral aspects of economic growth. And I think in the next 25 years, if India has to continue to grow, and we are seeing wavering of our economic growth, right? The reason is that because ideologies are going to come in conflict with these aspects. So if India has to grow between 75 to 100 years, at its potential, and you again said India will double from 3 trillion to 6 trillion in the next decade. Well, that's a good performance, but if you see it in relative terms of how the world will grow, whether it is China, even the US, it will turn out to be a mediocre performance if India continues to grow at sub-single digits or low 5 to 7% growth rate. So, if over the next 75 to 100 years, if we have to really, in this 25-year span, if we have to really grow, we have to make our economic growth politically and ideologically neutral. That is irrespective of political ideologies. Let, at least on those aspects that I mentioned, we continue to grow. And since we were asked to mention, I have 3 things how you can do that. And these are my 3 suggestions. I'll wind it up with that. 1, all politics in India over the next 25 years is going to revolve around political leaders. This is good news for us. There are going to be less than 10 people in India who will be politically important. Somehow if you can convince them that economic growth has to be neutral and get a consensus. Second, execute delivery of economic growth to practitioners and not theorists. People who can deliver and not people who can talk about it. And thirdly, transform your financial architecture to support it, right from the finance ministry downwards. If these 3 things you can continue to do sensibly in the next few years, you will be able to deliver a good economic growth between 75 to 100.
One brief follow-up. Revedi culture versus welfareism. The debate that we are right now in the middle of. I mean, everyone is doing freebies. Every state government, states are broke. While the PM is saying, look, we've got to do welfare to the people, but freebies are going to kill the Indians. So just briefly, this debate, I mean, how do you...
This debate has no end because this is a constant in the Indian political culture. And that's what I said, distribution will always be political. The question is, can you leave this distribution to politicians and let them do it? Can you bring the growth, employment, those aspects to technocrats? That is the shift I am talking about.
Thanks, Sat. I want to change the sequence a bit, bring in Parth, Shah. I think you can rightly follow. Can you eliminate ideology from economic strategy? We've seen contestation even in the most advanced economies. So within India, that if you say, look, growth is the principal ideology, Shaurya has already talked about problem of distribution, egalitarianism, etc. Those issues are not going to die down. But for you, the urgency of jobs, how do you deal with that? Is it going to be jobless growth, or is there a strategy to actually expand the job market?
Thank you. I think let me make my first point that I think I want to draw from what Shaurya said, right? My sense is that in the current debate around ideologies or the economic approaches, right, the fault is seen with the economics. My sense of fault actually lies with politics, right? So the whole debate around globalization, for example, is seen from the economic perspective, who is losing, who is gaining in this international trade, right? What I'm looking at is that the political system that we have is actually failing to live up to the expectations and demands of the growing internationalized, globalized economy, right? So I think I see a conflict between economics, which is far ahead, in a sense, right? And the politics, which is still stuck in this debate around freebies or whichever one that we want to talk about, right? I think that unless we bridge that gap between economics and politics in that sense, I don't really see how we can find a way to move forward towards prosperity in a peaceful manner, right? And the way I see how the politics needs to be fixed, right, is largely, I think, what Gandhiji had talked about a long time ago. I know Gandhi is not so popular now, but in many of his ideas somehow have been quite relevant. And I also discovered some of this thing very recently, right? As you remember, Gandhi actually talked about dissolving Congress after independence, saying that no, main function of Congress was independence, which has been achieved. We don't need a Congress to turn into a political party. And one of the key reasons that he had for asking for dissolution of Congress was that we don't want, because he was an anarchist by nature, right? So we don't want a centralized government. We want democracy, which is grassroots, right? Which is bottom up. Right? And I think we have not yet thought about how to bring about that kind of democracy in place, which is participatory and I mean more than participatory in that sense, right? And there are many ideas which are on the table to do it. So my sense is that the debate around ideology is sort of somehow misplaced, because I don't really see that as an important factor in where we want to go in the future. I see that bridging the gap between economics, which is far ahead, and political system, which is still set in 17th, 18th century, is the gap that we need to bridge.
I thought you would contest Shaurya, but you seem to agree. But I just want one question, one follow-up. If you want to say one big thing India must do to bridge the gap you talked about, what would be that one single thing we need to do to change the political culture?
We have as you know, I'm with the Indian School of Public Policy. We just fourth batch of the school started this week. And we had the same discussion what India needs to do for this purpose, right? Now, again, I would just point to one example about ideology so far out from the reality, right? Think about a cycle rickshaw puller in Delhi. There's a law in Delhi and all cities of India which says that the driver of the rickshaw, cycle rickshaw, and the owner must be the same person. What it means that you cannot rent a cycle rickshaw. The owner must be the driver. Now you can imagine the logic behind why we have such a policy, right? Which probably is to help the ownership of cycle rickshaws by people who drive them, and obviously primarily to remove the thekedars as a middleman in the system, right? Now, if you analyze what actually has happened on the ground, is exactly the opposite, right? Today, most rickshaws are rented, not really owned by people who ply them, right? For a simple reason that many of the people who come to work in our cities to run rickshaws, right, are migrants, right? They come here for a few months, go back, right? Now, imagine a situation where if I come from Bihar to, say, Delhi, I have to buy a rickshaw to be able to ply one, right? Even if I buy one, I would have to resell it after 4 or 5 months when I have to go back, right? You can imagine what the price of rickshaw would be when everybody wants to buy, and then what it would be when everybody wants to sell at the end of the, in a sense, season.
Thanks.
So I'm just saying that ideology is too far removed from the basic things that we need to change. I think somehow we think that 91 reforms have pretty much done everything that needs to be done for liberalization, and there is nothing more to be done. But I think ground realities are so different.
I hope Uber is listening to you, that ownership and, who takes the money out of what gets generated. So, but anyway, so let me bring in Joshua Thomas here. We talk about 75th year of India's independence. It's also the 75th year of India's partition. While there's not much discussion on it, but the fact that the subcontinent got broken up along with the independence, probably one of the greatest tragedies, and we changed the geography of the subcontinent in many ways. And while India was broken up, as it happened, China got united. So you had, China was in a civil war before 49, China gets united, India gets broken up. But today, post-91, we've been talking about reintegration, regionalism, connectivity. These have become common themes. But as India begins to try and promote regionalism, regional integration, it finds there is another big guy already around you, that the 30 years of the Chinese growth, or 40 years of Chinese growth, puts China in a much ahead of you in promoting regional economic growth. And we are battling for space, even within our own region, forget the rest of the world. So this whole strategy of integrating our region, how do you manage that in the face of China, which is the second largest economy, has strong political will to project power into the subcontinent? So since you come from the Northeast, we do a lot of talk about look east, Northeast. But the fundamental question is, how do we deal with Chinese economic power in our neighborhood if we want to triumph as a regional power?
Thank you, Professor Rajamohan. Let me express my sincere thanks to Dr. Shamir for making it possible for me to be in this great intellectual forum. Thank you, Dr. Mohan, for giving me some idea what I have to speak at this short 3 or 4 minutes. Now, talking about
3 would be nice.
Talking about India, China, we need much time. But given the short time, we have to first of all understand that China and India are the most populous countries, and also they have been with trust deficit for a long time. China has a great strategy for global domination. We know the string of pearl strategy, which after 2004 they have started trying to influence our neighbors, down Sri Lanka, in the south, in the east, Myanmar, and in the west, they have tried to influence countries like Maldives and Tanzania. Then we have our Pakistan and Gwadar port. And the name of connectivity for prosperity, the theme they have taken at BRI and CPEC, and all the things, and of course their huge investment in Bangladesh, in Nepal, and other countries, and of course the Chinese incursion in India's border, all the things, it has brought the dragon on our doorstep or at our doorstep. Now, economically, militarily, India is not equal to China, as you have already mentioned. But the global environment had made India to play a significant role. Very soon, we are going to take over as the president of G20. And also, destiny has made India to be in the Indian Ocean. Now, I would like to say a few things, how we can stay relevant to our neighborhood when we are dealing with China. Now, there are 4 things I would like to flag up. Actually, absolutely,
Briefly.
I will make it much more simpler. First and foremost, we need to understand Chinese operating system. We need to promote multipolarity. And also, what Dr. Rajamohan has said, we need to have like-minded parties, our alignment, and also we need to promote democracy. The second need, we have to have an alternative economic model to our neighboring countries. We cannot compete with China, but we can give space and also, sort of supporting hand to our neighboring countries by opening our markets for them for trade and investment. Yeah. The third very important need to have diplomacy for development. In fact, I have identified core areas where we can have much influence with our neighboring countries and keeping the dragon at bay. First is infrastructure diplomacy. Second one, public good diplomacy. Third one, food and fuel diplomacy. And fourth one, health aid diplomacy. And the last one, educational aid diplomacy. As our Prime Minister has said in the Shangri-La dialogue.
I think you said all the right 4 proposals. I think they're very good. Let's hear on those, which would
Okay,
be, yeah.
I'll stop here.
So let me move to, I think we've covered initially the economic stuff as well as the, the region. I think we just get into that. We got into China. I mean, I want to turn to Harinder. The US, I mean, the big, factor in our foreign policy or domestic debate in the last 20 years. We do on the security front things with the US, which you'd have thought almost treasonous a few years ago. Our trade is the biggest with the United States at $160 billion. Yet there is a lot of ambivalence. So love the US, love not, or hate the US, maybe love the US. So we have this lot of ambivalence in terms of how we deal with the US. So the question, Prime Minister has said in his speech to the US Congress 5 years ago, 6 years ago, India's historic hesitations in dealing with the US are over, and that India is ready for a big partnership with the US. But is our system really ready for that? And are the people ready for that? So the problem, the resistance to a more productive relationship with the US, what is blocking it? So is it the principle of strategic autonomy, or is it the terms of engagement? So it is the principle or price, or is it a question of whether you want to do it on the basis of your interests? The problem is the terms. It is not the question of the principle of coalition with the US, but what are the terms of engagement? So can we negotiate terms of engagement that suit us? So we're not just, as I said, if you're going to be a $7 trillion economy, you're not going to be in anybody's pocket. So is there a confident way of thinking about the US and the West in the days ahead?
Thank you, Dr. Rajamohan, and
Speak into the mic.
And thanks a lot to Samir for giving me this opportunity to be here. So I've, basically 2 quick points. And,
US has a bigger voice. I think
the US has a bigger voice. Am I more audible now? Is it better?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's basically, I think how we engage, you put the question. I think our foreign policy choices to a great extent are still going to be determined by what we achieve domestically. The US is not an easy partner to engage with, as we have seen, and we will be naive to think that we will get free lunches with the United States. We have done pretty well so far by, having a issue-based kind of an engagement with the United States, and we have managed to do pretty well with Ukraine as well. And what we need to keep in mind, as we have seen more recently, that the West and the US still, India has emerged as a very important partner to the United States, to Europe, but the US and the West still engage with us on their terms, on what they seek from India. Even when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, there are concerns in India. Does the US really address our border issue with China? Does it throw us in the forefront? And so I feel, it's not on India's terms. So at a certain level, we are probably not we are confident, but at the same time, we are a work in progress when it comes to dealing with the United States. They have given us the sanctions waiver, but, it's a constant effort. H-1B visas, trade, $500 billion has not happened. So those are going to remain challenging issues. So the US has been pushing more towards the strategic partnership. Are we really comfortable doing that? And we will continue balancing our bets, hedging our bets between the United States. And I think Indrani mentioned that we will have to make that strategic choice sooner or later, and the time will come. I agree with her. But I think, we really need to negotiate with the United States. If we could, basically build upon our core strengths, and that is, military power, economic power. We are nowhere near the United States and nowhere what we aspire to be. But we do have the soft power advantage, as we noticed, and I think the previous speaker talked about it, the vaccine diplomacy. So if we can channelize those, but what I started off with, to be relevant, we first need to set our own house in order. It's very nice to say we've been a work in progress 20 years back, 18 years back when I got into this policy making world. We used to talk about India's youth dividend, it should not become a youth bulge. We're still talking about it. So I think till we do not set our domestic priorities right, we do not have a roadmap which is implemented, not just talked about in the corridors of power. That is the need of the hour, because the West still keeps us. I mean, Russia also kept us out of all the negotiations on Afghanistan. Today I read that, there's been some rare earths and minerals, US-led kind of an agreement. India's not there. So how do we get there? This is where, we really need to have a domestic debate and a roadmap. Thank you.
So how do we get our act together? I think Vivan is going to speak on that. But before that, I was fascinated by this headline in the Indian Express where I read this morning about US keeping India out of a minerals alliance. Until now, the newspapers will say, why is India sitting with the US? And suddenly now we are saying, why are we not there with the US? So quite a transformation. Though I think, look, on the critical minerals, as Navdeep and there's a lot of negotiations already on with Australia, with Japan. So I didn't really understand the story, but I think it tells you the change in the mood from saying it's dangerous to sit with the Americans to saying we want to sit more with the Americans. So that's a change. So let me bring in Raji here. One of the buzzwords about multipolar, unipolar, bipolar, strategic autonomy, a lot of times these seem to actually confuse the policy choices rather than enlighten us, and that we keep going round and round. At the core of it, you could say, look, this is really a description of the international system. At the end of 91, there was a unipolar world. America was dominant. But today, US and Russia and China are in an alliance. US, after Ukraine, has consolidated the Western alliance. So you could argue, I mean, I'm not saying it's a final argument, but there is a bipolar system. That's one part. Second, you could say in Asia, for a long time, we said we are working with the Chinese and the Russians to produce a multipolar world. But suddenly you find there is a unipolar Asia. China dominates all the other BRICS countries, all the other Asian countries. And one reason why we are working with the US is to limit Chinese unipolar Asia and actually do multipolar Asia rather than a multipolar world. Because previously it was about limiting American power. Today, a multipolar Asia would be about limiting Chinese power. So this transition, is that come through in our policy debates and choices?
Thank you, Dr. Rajamohan. No, I think this is a very interesting debate. And I think I want to start with questioning the fundamental assumption that multipolarity is good and that it is in our national interest. And that is with the assumption that it is in our national interest and that India has the capacity to change the outcomes in India's favor, to effect changes in it. To influence developments in our favor, to get our policy outcomes that are ultimately in India's national interest. But that is going to be, I think, polarity essentially is measured in terms of the power, that the material capacity to influence things in a sense. And I think it's not exactly about what you desire or what you want to see as the outcome, but I think it's going to be measured in terms of the distribution of power. And I think that when you look at the distribution of power, US and China are right on top. US at about $23 trillion, China about $20 trillion. India is only about $3.17, and that tells you the material capacity for India to play that kind of a role that you assume that in a multipolar world that India will be a major pole, a significant pole that can affect changes. So I think that's a first point that I want to make. Multipolarity not necessarily is in India's interest, and unless India strengthens its material capacity to influence changes, that is not going to be happening. Second, I think the whole question is about strategic autonomy. Again, we keep hearing about this, but I think the key question is what is it that we are looking for in strategic autonomy? You assume that if you don't have the strategic autonomy, things are going to not go in your favor. There are going to be threatening, some of the issues may threaten your own national interest. But I think nobody is free to do whatever we want in any part of the world. No country is going to be able to do that. So some levels autonomy may be better than some of the others in a sense. So India has to make the choice of, do we want living under the Chinese hegemony? Is that the kind of option that we want to look at? Rajamohan talked about Chinese hegemony. or being in partnership with like-minded countries so that you can shape the kind of, so that you prevent the Chinese hegemony possibly. And I think that's a kind of choice that you want to make. I don't think we have on our own. Either you can have your own material capacity so that you don't have to depend on other countries to kind of prevent the Chinese hegemony, to kind of first, and even if China was, and China is a country that you have problems with, you have border and territorial issues with, you have an ongoing conflict with China on the border. And I don't think that is going to go away anytime soon, which means that you are essentially, when you look at it, if you're talking about a bipolar power, it is not the previous Cold War scenario that you're looking at. Here is a country that you have serious baggage of history, in terms of the political issues, in terms of the having gone into war with each other and the continuing conflict. So that's not a pole of power that you can actually partner with and so on and so forth. So what is the kind of bargain that you can find? Can you work with other like-minded partners? It's in your own national interest that you need to look at, and no country in the world is going to be completely autonomous and independent to make their choices. But I think you need to kind of make a cost-benefit analysis. Is this the power that I want to be? So how do I manage the Chinese hegemony? How do I manage the Chinese power? If I don't have the capacity, can I partner with like-minded countries like the US and other countries?
Thank you, Raji. Now we go to the last panelist, Vivan. I mean, you heard so many different aspects here. I mean, on the question of economy, on the question of technological revolution, on the question of regional connectivity, on the question of international relations. But in all this, there was already a reference to, do we have our act together? Especially if we're going to become a $7 trillion economy in the next 10 years. The nature of your society, the nature of your markets, the nature of your region, the nature of your international relations, everything is going to change. So is there sufficient state capacity to address these things? And if we don't, how do we supplement that? And what role can think tanks play in that?
Thank you, Dr. Mohan. I think the question you pose is fundamental, because obviously the kind of state that we had for the 3 trillion economy is not going to suffice for 5 or 7. So it's not necessarily the case that because we have this big base, it's going to be easy to multiply to 7 and 10. In fact, it's going to get progressively harder, which is where I think the role of civil society and, fostering a marketplace of ideas comes in. But, CSOs now need to go, or think tanks need to go much beyond thought leadership, which of course in international relations there's been quite a decent amount of, perhaps a little less in matters related to the economy. But I see 4 or 5 prominent areas where think tanks should play a role. The first is regulation. I think India is now setting a template for a kind of regulation, particularly of new markets, that involves necessarily a dimension of co-regulation at the top. The digital media and social media rules are evidence of that, but we have miles to go, and regulation can be thought of as a triad between judicial function, regulation, and appellate authorities. And just a proxy to understand how far we have to go is that today in India, the telecom appellate authority is the same authority that has to dispense with cases related to the airports authority and airlines. It has to dispense with things to do with cyber, and clearly we don't have the capacity in these institutions to do that. So co-regulation, involvement of civil society is important. Enforcement, another area where we can't really move the needle unless state capacity is supplemented by civil society. For instance, today we have all these discussions like we did today around disintermediation of various agents because of digitization. But that disintermediation also comes with its own unique enforcement challenges that cannot be overcome with the current levels of state capacity. Your FEMA and PMLA are just examples of that, where the ability to track money going across borders is going to diminish as technology becomes the vehicle for finance, as it already is. So today we have a complaints-led enforcement ecosystem where individuals go and complain to enforcement authorities, and then that escalates into investigation and cases. But eventually we're going to have to democratize that. We're going to have to involve civil society innately in that process. Similarly with audits. Today, just to take an example of food standards, the FSSAI has about 25 crores in its coffers from license fees and another 70 lakh from testing fees. And if you look at the average spend that it will have to do across the country to ensure food quality, certainly it cannot be made, the case cannot be made that this is adequate by any measure. So in audit too, civil society and think tanks have a role. And finally, I think while Ms. Roy alluded to the fact that we are now transitioning from being rule takers to rule makers in digital, I think a precursor to rule making and rule taking for that matter is to also be involved deeply in standard setting, as she mentioned, around protocols. And there, I think, outside of public digital platforms, which we certainly are leading on, there is need for much greater state capacity enhancement via civil society, whether it be on the important question, for instance, of central bank digital currency, which the world is debating, or any other form of emerging technology standard setting, whether it be AI, ML, blockchain, AR, VR, XR. These are all important areas now for civil society to start weighing in. So I think to end with this, public interest has to be reconceptualized as the connecting tissue between the political ideology and economic ideology that Shaurya mentioned. I think we have to emphasize or re-emphasize the economic dimension of public interest in the laws that we make and the standards that we set and the way in which we engage with civil society with openness and trust.
Thank you. I just want to, before I open up for the audience, I just wanted to go back to Anna Roy, because Anna Roy represents the biggest think tank in India, probably the most important one. I mean, with apologies to ORF, that the Niti Aayog is really set up as a way of thinking about India's future, and I think we've seen that. The report on artificial intelligence, or now on a range of issues, we've seen that. But I think you mentioned the internal, we saw today the democracy at work, the data protection law was withdrawn, because there was interventions, there are questions about the rest of the stakeholders. And externally too, from saying we don't like free trade to one of actually negotiating trade agreements in the last few years. And within all this, the digital question, and more broadly, the technological question, keeps coming up very, very prominently. For example, on digital trade, what is the philosophical position we take? Second, on outer space, the MEA used to say space is the province of all mankind. But today, US-China competition, US-Russia competition is producing new competition in the way we set rules in space. We're going to let Elon Musk and Amazon dominate it? Or are we going to do more privatized space sector, participate more actively? So seemingly set positions that the Indian Foreign Office articulated in the global level are under stress, and they must be driven not by what he said, look, are we doing something great for multilateralism? I think the taxpayers are paying money to MEA to actually protect India's interests. And that's where I think the whole of the government approach. Where do you see on the digital side, on the technology side, the role of the Niti Aayog, and how are we going to navigate this transition?
So, I was wondering why I am in this panel, because this is such a heavyweight diplomacy panel, and that's not really my forte. On the digital side, as Vivan said, I think, not to talk about digital trade or anything, I think I would like to underline the philosophy of the government, what Shaurya just mentioned, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. It started in 2014 with financial inclusion, and I feel that has been the cornerstone for all subsequent digital initiatives by the government. You speak about Amazon. I tell you about ONDC. So, it is one thing to kind of take up these issues with MNCs, and totally different to change the entire narrative by focusing on public digital goods. So, I will come back to the point that this government has leveraged technology with a very outcome-oriented manner, never wavering from the principles of inclusive growth, whether it is in finance, whether it is in health, in education. So while Vivan may not be very happy that we are not doing a very great job in gaming or in crypto, what you may have, but I think the government has its heart in the right place when it says education is important for me, health is important for me, and I'm going to create a level playing field, A. Second, I'm going to relegate the government to the position the government should be in. That is, it should be the enabler. And third, I will not crowd out the private sector. I will allow the startup movement to really gain force. So these things take time. These things do not happen overnight. And I think it is this openness which is really changing the way we are going forward. And it is also not a very top-down approach, because the very idea of replacing the erstwhile Planning Commission with Niti Aayog was to give a vision and then let all stakeholders come together, including civil society. Now, besides the national strategy on AI, we work very close. We have done a lot of work in responsible AI. And even Prime Minister has mentioned that please do not lose sight of what the technology can do to you, but also, you know, how it has affected in a very negative way also. Don't lose sight of that. So civil society has been consulted in that exercise, and I think that is what should be focused on. And I guess I said my bit. Thank you.
No, I think the foreign policy can't do much if your economic policy, your internal transformation does not do it. So we all quote Kautilya, but Kautilya's book is called Arthashastra, which is really economics and statecraft. I mean, I think that's where some of the transitions that the government is doing. For example, I think the Prime Minister's repeated speeches in the last few months, a privatization of space sector, that India needs a larger share of the global space trade, and private sector should not be treated as vendors by the government departments, the science departments. That why is India, which used to produce weapons before Second World War, has become the world's largest importer. So I think there are big ideas there. I think all this involved technology, collaboration, building coalitions. So you think those ideas are percolating downwards in the system in terms of how we negotiate with outside countries, as well as how we negotiate within the stakeholders at home?
Again, I would not like to comment, because my co-panelist, I think, better positioned to talk about how we negotiate with outside countries. Within the country, I can really tell you that I have seen the change since 2014, and technology is really driving. Access issues, other barriers are being overcome, and we have the game plan in view. And I think I have repeated myself on that point. I would not like to repeat it, but I would not like to comment on the international relations. I think my co-panelists are better placed to speak on that.
No, thank you. Thank you for those interventions, since you are really in the actual policy-making side. We're all outsiders, but I think it's been a very valuable engaging, and I think all the panelists have raised a number of interesting set of questions. I don't know where Jahnavi is. I mean, we might have about 10 minutes. They might want to, the Foreign Secretary will be coming shortly. So I think we have about 10 minutes, shall we say. So please feel free to ask questions, but no asking questions for the whole panel, because we are 7 of us here, or 8 of us here. So sharp question, and one of them will respond. And maybe I'll take 3. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Akash, and my question is on economic growth. Don't you think we need to have governance reforms at the municipal levels? Rather than 10 leaders, we need to have 100 city administrators who have better autonomy on functions, functionaries, and some sort of funds. So don't you think we need better autonomous municipal corporations in cities rather than 10 top leaders?
Okay, cities. Yeah. Then, next. Yeah.
Right. My name is Orko. This question is actually to Mr. Joshua Thomas, and anyone else can add in. You spoke about diplomacy for development, and obviously with the agenda at hand for this panel as to how we look for the next 25 years, my primary understanding is on connectivity and regional growth. Recently, the Northeast India Festival in Bangkok was also concluded. So the problem has been, if we take up Kaladan multimodal project, again a development project, there is a lack in terms of completion of projects, and so with that in mind, when we're talking about diplomacy for development, be it outward or even internal with the aspect of Northeast, how can we really see this being worked upon in the next 25 years before we reach 100 years? And do you all also see the role of G20 in any way so as to primarily focus on this particular factor through the working groups or any other engagement groups that we talk about? Thank you.
How do we implement projects, which is a big problem? Yeah, sir. We keep it brief. And
Yes, I'm Rohit, and my question is to Mr. Vivan. In the long term, in order to revive Indo-Pacific, it is very important that we should have community-driven initiatives and civil society engagement. My question is, should the government actually have a strategy to make it possible, or are these things supposed to naturally happen?
okay, I think we'll just go to the panel. I mean, there are questions on sorry. So I'll take the next round, 3. So we'll just get this quickly done so that on the question of cities, Shaurya, would you like to answer? I mean, can we liberate the cities from the provincial tyranny?
See, that's a long debate. The question that, if that question was directed towards me on the 10 leaders, I was speaking in a different context. This is a much bigger debate about cities, etc. What I was trying to say was that in the next 25 years, how realistic it is that if you want to de-link ideology from the technical parameters of economic growth, what are the few things? And it was in that context that I said how the power equation in the country is and is likely to remain over the next 25 years. But in the long run, you are absolutely right. We are all working towards a democratization of India, where governance will have to ultimately go down to the lowest level.
Joshua, on the project implementation, very briefly.
Thank you. It's a very vital question. As far as the connectivity is concerned, it's much more important for us. Now, how we are completing the project, there are 2 things needed. First thing is political will and periodic monitoring of this project which we have sanctioned, which we have undertaken. We have different agencies in our countries which can monitor. For example, in the India's Northeast, we have NEC, Northeastern Council, which is basically a policy advocacy agency, which is also looking after the project completion agency. So the government of India needs to empower these agencies to see that the projects are executed at the fast track. In fact, Kaladan Malad project, which you have mentioned, it's a long pending overdue. It needs government of India's serious attention.
Yeah,
Or in the case of trilateral
you
highways.
want to answer the last question? Vivan, you want to very briefly?
Yeah, there are too many areas to recount on this rather expansive question. I guess a few of them, obviously, there's a need to be trustful, I guess, and lateral hiring is one proxy. I think we're moving in the right direction, not doing enough. And I'm not suggesting that lateral hiring is a silver bullet. Funds, I don't know why we've been stuck in this general financial rules paradox or paradigm for the last 75 years. We're trying to move out of it. Still can't quite get to an L1, Q1 quality-based assessment of vendors. So, if you start a CSO tomorrow, you're going to have a lot of trouble trying to empanel yourself with government. Relevance, I think, the more you engage civil society in public consultations and build coalitions earnestly with civil society to tackle issues like consumer welfare and so on and so forth, the better. And finally, I guess, the government has to release funds on time. A lot of us do a lot of work for different government organizations and then don't get paid on time. And they should release funds on time with interest, because the government, when you go to them and ask them for money, they say there's no money problem. There's a contracting problem, but eventually there also is a money problem. Yeah, and I think that is extremely crippling for civil society capacity in the country.
Thanks, Vivan. So we can take one more round. We got about 5 more minutes. Who was the hand this side? Somebody, you were pointing to someone. Yeah, please. Oh, sorry.
My name is Shashank. I work for the Observer Research Foundation. My question is to Mr. Doval. So you mentioned...
To whom?
To Mr. Doval. So your question, you had talked about a political economic model for the country where, political power was concentrated in to de-link ideology, we would hand power to technocrats for economic growth. My question to you was, are we already at that stage in this country where a few political leaders have the power and they've divested, for example, policy-making control to technocrats. If we aren't there, what steps do we need to take to get to that sort of political model? And just as a quick follow-up to that, are there any top-line reform items that you think would really benefit from this changed political economic model in the country, where a few political leaders have the power and give it to bureaucrats to make the changes that they need to change that would turbocharge growth?
Pradeep?
Mine is a reflection rather than a question, Raja, if you permit. See, politics always trumps economics. So let's be clear. It's not ideology alone, but politics generally trumps economics. Politics always takes. Let me give you an example of this, which happened recently, and something which was raised, not directly but indirectly. The farm bills, excellent competition reforms, improperly introduced, and therefore it lost. Same thing was going to happen to Agniveer also. Fortunately, that has not happened.
I think make it a... Yeah.
The point is that, is there a consultation going on? That's first point, before you bring in reforms. Second point, and this is something which has been raised by even a BJP MP, fortunately. Somebody has started talking about it. Second point is that we need to have competition reform. This government is doing a lot of competition reform, but each of them are ad hoc. Anna Roy spoke about the DBT, for example. It's a huge competition reform. There are so many things. Exit policy, for example, the insolvency, etc., etc. These are all competition reforms. We need more in a systematic way. Finally, to conclude, we need to improve our competitiveness. Otherwise, our exports will never be, cheap. And without exports, we can't grow. As was pointed out by Amitabh also in the morning. Thank you.
So, is anyone else? Last call? Yeah. No, you're not.
This would probably be for both Ms. Anna Roy and Rajeswari, Rajagopalan. How do you transfer, or how do you make these sectors that are fast growing, and India has shown tremendous potential, for example, the digital or even commercial space? How does India make a proposition for the next decade or so, where these become global, offerings for others to adopt? And how do you transfer the financial inclusion framework, for example, ma'am, that you mentioned in technology, to say Latin America or Africa or other geographies that are still grappling with some of those issues? And Raji, how do we, rather than just service the rich countries in the space sector, how do we service the next 6 billion who don't have access to some of those space services? So how do you look ahead in these two sectors?
Okay, Raji first, and then we'll ask Anna.
Yeah, I think I wanted to relate to the question that you raised again. For instance, India has come out with the space reforms. We have talked about it. Prime Minister Modi, as well as Finance Minister, have made talks about the big reforms that they want to bring to the space sector. But I think those are just big pronouncements. How they are going to be implemented through appropriate regulatory frameworks, that is the key, and that will enable the private sector, which is a capable actor in the, outside of the ISRO, to improve the competitiveness that you talked about. Unless India improves the competitiveness and makes its a capacity to deliver on the possible multipolar world order that we want to reach, I think it's going to be a huge difficulty in a sense. In terms of Samir's question, I think we have done some bit in the last few years. At least we have realized the need to engage smaller countries, developing countries, in terms of reaching out to them, build up their space capabilities, build up the satellite connectivity, and so on and so forth. But that's been just a far and few what we have done so far. But I think that's something that's an area that we need to step up in a big way. But that really goes back to ISRO's capacity is limited, and how do we build and bring in the private sector as a capable actor to deliver on the promises that we can actually deliver on.
So, Anna, you'll have the last word.
Thank you. So, one reference I would like to give is this year's budget. And there were 4 paras relating to technology, more than 4 actually, but the 4 of them were referred to me, so I can talk about it. One of them was on sunrise sectors. And the way we are, developing it with what Samir said, the 10 years horizon. And I think That is one way of doing it. You identify the sunrise sectors and you set the plan, and that is in motion. So I would like to refer to that initiative of the government. Secondly, about replicating what we have done, it is a very, in digital to get international coordination on protocols, other standards, etc. It's a very, very tricky thing, but we are doing it in a very curated manner. And we have made very good progress, at least on the DAPA issue with EU and other such countries. And Latin American and other countries are also in the being approached. UPI is already being exported, the India stack, and as we develop the other platforms, there also we are approaching the other countries about how we can replicate in their economies. And I think in G20, one of the, as president, we can push some new agenda topics, and data for development is one of the topics. Similarly, public digital platforms is another topic which India will be raising in G20. So I think through multilateral forums as well as bilateral platforms, we are kind of exporting many of our initiatives.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The time is up, as we're being reminded. So I really want to close this by just offering 3 quick takeaways. I mean, you heard from this panel the range of policy challenges that present before us. And the opportunity for India, which is a different India, a rising India, that its capacity to make a difference to itself, to its people, as well as to the international system. And I think for the first time, we can be a lot more optimistic and confident about this dynamic interaction between India and the world. Second, I think, as one of the ideas that came, I mean, the think tanks have a large role. We've already seen the government consults the think tanks a lot more. There's a lot more engagement. But I would say sometimes we think tanks tend to draw red lines, Lakshman Rekhas, and we stand behind them. So I think we can expand the debate, argue politely. We don't have to be part of the polarized political contestation. There's room, I think, for different ideas. 1,000 ideas, I think, as Anna Roy said, for 1,000 ideas to bloom. So I think there is room for us to think creatively and to expand the discourse, argue in a civil manner, and to open up options for the government and for India to transform itself. So let me finally say to thank the ORF for actually bringing us this forum together at a very critical moment. Before I close and hand over to the next session where the Foreign Secretary is waiting, please put your hands together for a wonderful panel.